what is clearly an inflection point in the unfolding of the Mueller investigation. The first public splintering of the Justice Department against Mueller's team. Because the news tonight is that for the very first time, whatever private or heated debates have occurred between Mueller's team and their supervisors at the Trump Justice Department in the past, now we're seeing some spill into public view for the first time. The New York Times and other outlets reporting that top people on Mueller's team disagree with Attorney General Bill Barr's efforts to what they see as downplay their evidence and key findings on Trump. The New York Times quoting secondhand sources who say that Mueller's investigators have strong evidence against Trump and that Barr was not totally accurate in his rush to release quotes and his own opinion in his now famous letters to Congress. Now, there may have been private disagreements during the 22 months of the probe. If they're private, we still wouldn't know about them. And Rod Rosenstein was in charge for most of that period. But we never really saw daylight between Mueller's office and the DOJ during that time. Today, we're seeing a high-stakes rift go public right after Mueller turned in his report and before Congress has obviously seen any of it. So, in the spirit of thinking about where we're going, before I go into a few more of the details of why Barr's approach is in question, is under fire tonight, I want you to consider where we are in the timeline on the substance. Not the D.C. messaging, but on substance. Bob Mueller worked for almost 2 years, issuing 37 indictments and handing in a nearly 400-page report. And right now, we are currently in the waiting period between the DOJ getting that report, that happened, and the DOJ deciding how to share it, or some of it, with Congress and potentially the public. So on substance, these few weeks right now may ultimately look like the blink of an eye. Because whether it's 2 weeks or 4 or 6, the rules always provided for this time, this gap period between Mueller finishing and Barr dealing with Congress. But then you have this D.C. messaging, where the Attorney General has decided to seize on this very waiting period as his time to strike out in public, to release his series of letters, to describe what he calls parts of Mueller's findings, and then what he admits, and credit to him for admitting it, Barr using this waiting period before others have the evidence to go well beyond what he says Mueller even found and announce his own views in public, whipping up reactions across the nation. Now, as we've reported on this show, from the very day Mueller finished, those reactions are mainly to Barr and how the probe ended, not to Mueller's report, which no one outside the DOJ has, of course, seen. So when you take that all together, this waiting period, it makes it more notable and maybe more telling that it is right now, during this waiting period, when not everyone has the same evidence and facts and findings, that we are hearing Mueller's investigators reportedly decided they had to speak out now. They couldn't wait longer to address what they see as Attorney General Barr's mischaracterizations of some of their work. So 22 months of the probe and basically no leaks. 2 weeks of Barr describing the probe's findings, and now there are signs of leaks at least linked to Mueller's team. Of course, Barr rushed to clear Trump by claiming to describe the report, even though, and I've said this before, I'll repeat it again tonight, even though the best news for Donald Trump isn't even in the Mueller report, as far as we know. It's in the fact that Bob Mueller finished his probe without charging a conspiracy. We know that without seeing a report. It is Mr. Barr's apparent reaching on the report's other alleged content, his need to issue his own view on obstruction, that has begun to draw so much pushback. Mueller's investigators, and here's where I'll get into a few more of the details for you, say they found that it is more troubling for Trump, what is in the Mueller report, than Barr has implied. One source stressing that Barr issued his own letters, even though there were independent summaries already, quote, prepared for different sections of the report, providing that each section could have been released immediately or very quickly, done in a way that minimum redactions would have been necessary and the work would have spoken for itself. Now, what I just read to you is a very specific leak. That is someone who the Washington Post has deemed credible, who claims to know details about the still secret contents of this Mueller report and how they say it was thoughtfully prepared so DOJ could release findings that Mueller wrote, not so that Barr could reframe them in his own series of letters. Now, these new reports are saying Barr's refusal to use those prepared summaries and substitute his own letters is suspicious. And House Democrats tonight, they say they're not having it. Judiciary Chair Nadler, who just got that subpoena vote for the Mueller report itself, now responding to these, quote, recent reports to demand Mueller's prepared summaries be publicly released as soon as possible. Now, that's a lot. this story could rest right here with a pending fight over 1, Barr's letters, and 2, the full Mueller report, and 3, the possible existence of these Mueller summaries that Barr allegedly pocketed. But that's not all. I have one more thing before I get to our guests. Because after Barr's letters on March 22nd and March 24th and March 29th, Barr is back out today with something new. It's not a formal letter, but it's a statement. And it says Mueller's report to Barr was stamped confidential on, quote, every page, implying that basically this is on Mueller, and stressing that Barr is working with Mueller on appropriate redactions to the report so that it can be released to Congress and the public. Notice that basically when Barr is facing this reported criticism from Mueller's team today, in that new statement, Barr is name-checking Mueller, seeming to both blame him for these decisions that we do know Barr made. I mean, agree with them or not, these are Barr's decisions. He's the boss. So he comes out today and he seems to blame Mueller about his decision to release those 4 partial quotes from the report. But then he also hugs Mueller as a source of authority and credibility, apparently, for this coming redaction fight. Now, I don't have all the answers for you. I never do. I tell you what we know, and I try to tell you what we don't know. So I'll tell you that for whatever reason, I don't know the reason tonight, but for whatever reason, Bill Barr wants you and everyone to know, hey, I'm still working with Mueller, even as he also disputes these reports that he overrode Mueller to the great concern of Mueller's team. And that brings us here to the final splinter tonight, because while Barr invokes Mueller for credibility, and while President Trump recently reversed his attacks to say Mueller acted honorably after the probe was concluded, another lawyer who works for Trump is breaking with his client and breaking with Attorney General Barr to blast Mueller's team for what he calls sticky, unethical leaking.
It makes the point that we've been making for 2 years, despite all of the media reports about how holy and sanctimonious the Mueller team is. They're a bunch of sneaky, unethical leakers. And they are rabid Democrats who hate the President of the United States.
I want to bring in Maya Wiley, a former counsel to the mayor of New York and a civil prosecutor in SDNY, and NBC's Heidi Prisbilla, our national political correspondent. Good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
What do you think of what Barr is doing, and do you believe he's trying to play both sides of Mueller?
I think he's trying to play both sides of Mueller. I think he's trying to do it, and what I give him credit for, because we know from his unsolicited memo to the White House about obstruction, and is that he has a very specific view both of executive privilege and of obstruction of justice. He's stuck with it. That summary and that decision that he and Rod Rosenstein say they made in that summary on obstruction is based on his interpretation of the law. And so in that sense, he's being very consistent. The point about the confidentiality stamping is silly. And the reason it is silly is because the rules actually say that the report is confidential and goes to the Attorney General as a confidential report. So, of course, it is stamped at the bottom confidential across it, by definition.
Let's build on that. You know, when they talk about reindeer games, this feels a little bit like lawyer games. We have the new Barr statement. He keeps writing statements. And in the news, that's always interesting. But it begins in a somewhat surly, lawyerly tone. Every page of the confidential report provided to Barr on March 22nd was marked may contain material protected under grand jury rules. It is the implication that Mueller made me do it this way. You don't buy that?
No, because it's really typical for that kind of stamp to exist whenever you have the potential to have material you would withhold. All that means is, it doesn't mean it should be, it doesn't mean it has to be. And usually, remember that one of the reasons Congress has a right to say, come and tell us, show us the report, tell us what privileges you're inserting, because they should have the ability to understand, are you saying it's executive privilege? Are you saying it's privacy? Are you saying it's grand jury? So you'd be indicating in that what kind of privilege might attach. But that's why, once we heard in the leaks, though, that Mueller was given an attorney general who said publicly that his interest was in transparency and having as much of this publicly available as possible. Frank Figliuzzi, who worked for Mueller, said, I would be surprised that he didn't prepare the report in a way that it could be very quickly made public because he understands what material would have been withheld.
Well, that is the reporting, too, out today, is that the intent of the investigators was that those summaries would be made public, and it would boggle the mind that such professional team of investigators wouldn't have that ready to go after 22 months of investigation. But I can tell you, Ari, that I talked just hours ago to a staff member who'd been briefed by one of the lawyers advising the Judiciary Committee, and they are giving Barr more time here. They're giving the courtesy of more time, but they fully expect this to go to court. The question here is whether, with one of the most consequential documents in modern history, the American people and Congress are being given as much information as possibly they can be given, or as little. And their take on this right now, given the classified redactions, which could very well be done by Congress, given Barr's refusal to go and get that court paper, that authorization to release the grand jury material, is that the verdict is that we are going to be given as little information as possible. And while, yes, Barr is operating under a different statute than Ken Starr, there's nothing in there that says that he can't give this information out. And so they're expecting to get something that is less than adequate. They hope that they're going to be surprised and that they're wrong, but this is what they're preparing for right now.
Well, it isn't Barr's problem that people are paying close attention. There are all sorts of games that people in public life play, and the experts like to invoke their expertise and hold it over everyone. But as we like to say around the newsroom, I may be slow, but I'm not dumb. It's the old newsroom saying. So it may take a couple days, but people are still watching and reading and listening. And so to believe Barr, you'd have to believe that this expert team led by Bob Mueller, who ran the FBI, who was a prosecutor, who's by the book, just sort of made these really random, sloppy endings, that they did not have a plan for how things could be revealed. The Washington Post and others, and your team, and Ken Delaney, who's going to join us in a minute, reporting, no, there was a plan. Again, legally, that doesn't mean AG Barr has to follow it. But the notion that they had no plan, they had no summaries, they had no way to help with the transparency process, you know, you'd have to be pretty dumb to think that was the ending. And likewise, the obstruction claims, there's a lot of interesting evidence, inference, that Mueller was very thoughtfully trying to put together the evidence, not that he was just waiting around like, oh my God, all of a sudden Bob Mueller doesn't know what suit to wear and what hat to wear and how to finish. He can't make decisions. And then you look at, before I bring in Ken, I want to ask you, Heidi, from your reporting, about the notion that as well, and we should always keep this in mind, if you ever remember Free to Be You and Me, great.
I love that.
It's an album I grew up on. People are people. And Mr. Barr is a person, and as a human being, he also, according to the New York Times, and I think your reporting reflects some of this, appears concerned about the way he is now being covered in his job. And the Times reports that Mr. Barr has shown flashes of frustration and chafed at how the news media and some lawmakers had characterized one of his letters.
Well, I'm sure he is, but I don't know how this couldn't have been anything but expected. And I'll tell you what wave 2 of this is going to be. We're already seeing today with this reporting what never happened during this investigation that's happening now, Ari, which you nicely laid out in your opener, which is the leaks. So if this information isn't inadequate and the investigators feel that their work is not being accurately represented in whatever the final product is that's given to Congress, I would expect more of that, and I know Congress expects more of that.
I think you put your finger on it. I mean, Andrew Weissman or whomever, there are people who work for Mueller who may have a shorter fuse than him. He may have a longer fuse, but people are people. This is a theme I've made up in the middle of our conversation, but I'm going to stand by it. He has a fuse, too. And so, as you say, there may be a court battle, there may be more characterizations, there may be more new Barr statements, but if Mueller's fuse is eclipsed and he conveys lawfully to the Congress that it might be a positive, good idea for transparency for him to testify, he can get all this back out in the open.
This is about constitutional authority, make no mistake. Even if Barr is going to make a determination here that there was nothing that rose to a crime, Congress's jurisdiction is to mete out whether there was wrongdoing here and
Right,
to
a high crime.
High crime. Well, exactly.
And there may not have been.
There may not have been, but that's separate from reviewing what was an attack on our democracy and deciding whether there were things that the president or his team did that fall just short of criminal but are extremely wrong.
Right, and that's a lot of blowback that Barr's dealing with. Hang with me. I want to bring in Ken Delaney for another piece of this, because as we've reported, we do know, even without the report, that Mueller concluded there was no chargeable conspiracy. That's the collusion issue. But the new reporting out of NBC says that the Mueller report did also include detailed accounts of Trump campaign contacts with Russia, that some members of Mueller's team say their findings paint a picture of a campaign whose members were manipulated by a sophisticated Russian intelligence operation. As promised, NBC's Ken Delaney, and part of the team that broke that story, joins me now. Good evening, sir.
Hello, Ari.
What did you find?
Well, this shouldn't be terribly surprising, frankly, for those of us who have paid close attention to this investigation over the last 2 years. A lot of this was in plain sight, right? But what I'm being told is that while the Mueller investigators don't have a problem with the way Barr characterized the lack of a conspiracy, because that's what they found, no criminal conspiracy, they said there's a lot more than just that one sentence that describes the Russia collusion part of their findings. You know, they're going to lay out the vast array of contacts between the Trump campaign and Russia. They're going to explain the context of it. They're going to explain how the Russians went about interfering in the election. They've already laid out some of this in public indictments. And the one thing that's not clear, Ari, is to what extent, and I'm sure it will be to some extent, this will be classified, and therefore we may not see the full picture. And there's also counterintelligence investigations that will live on, that have been already passed on to FBI field offices and U.S. attorneys' offices, because counterintelligence is not just about solving crimes, it's also about mitigating foreign influence
and that's
on the United
fine.
States.
I think the point, though, where the Trump folks have a point, as we've reported, is there was an exhaustive probe into whether there was a criminal conspiracy here to benefit from Russia or its associates. And the way that it ended showed no chargeable conspiracy. In your reporting, is there other things here that suggest bigger problems than the way that Barr put it, or we just don't know yet?
No problem with the way Barr characterized that. Mueller himself concluded there was no chargeable criminal conspiracy. But let's think about what else is possible there that would be very detrimental politically to the president and his team. You know, the notion that they were essentially useful idiots, dupes of a sophisticated covert Russian intelligence operation. We already saw that, you know, the president's son was willing to take a meeting and accept, you know, incriminating information from the Russians, which is something that was abnormal in the history of American
But let me, to push you on that, that's known and out there. So
yes.
when you have reporting that suggests people around Mueller are concerned about how it's coming out in the last 2 weeks, it's not that Bill Barr erased everyone's memory of the Trump Tower meeting. I mean, he may be good, but he's not Men in Black good. I mean, people remember that and they can do what they want about it. Is the concern then, or I guess let me rephrase, why is this coming out now?
I think, well, the way it was characterized to me is that, you know, you guys are all focusing on the one line that there was no criminal conspiracy, but there's a lot more here that maybe will be troubling to the American public,
right,
that should be explored about what the Trump campaign did, what the Russians did.
Right.
This will be consequential. Some of it will be classified, but stay tuned, essentially, was the message I got.
Got it.
This is in the report, and you should pay close attention to it.
Stay with me, Ken. Maya, I want to play one more thing as we look at this Fisher, which is pretty striking, and that is the relationship, long-running professional, between Barr and Mueller. Take a look.
Essentially, the president wanted to know, he said, oh, you know Bob Mueller. How well do you know Bob Mueller? And I told him how well I knew Bob Mueller and how, you know, the Barrs and Muellers were good friends and would be good friends when this is all over and so forth. And he was interested in that, wanted to know, you know, what I thought about, you know, Mueller's integrity and so forth and so on. And I said, Bob is a straight shooter and should be dealt with as such.
Do you have any feeling that this relationship now is being tested with the statements we're seeing? My rule of thumb is if this is what's in public, whatever's behind the scenes would be more, not less than this.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question that there's some testing of relationship. If you're Robert Mueller, and think about what Mr. Giuliani's kind of public statement in response to this was, right, where he sort of says, well, if this was so mischaracterized, you would have had Bob Mueller coming out and making a statement. And I think that that's really misunderstands the long-standing relationships between two people, where but also to his attention to the institution and to the process, where he understands how much attention is being paid here. He may have several reasons why he's not coming out and making public statements, both to the integrity of the process, to not wanting to make the narrative so pitched and so negative, and wants to let Congress play it out. And because he may have respect for Barr, despite the fact that this is putting them each in a very complicated situation,
right, and
in terms of their relationship.
That's why we're in such an interesting point, aided by your analysis and the reporting from Heidi and Ken and some of the other reporters we quoted tonight. A very interesting time. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.